Storybook title, Kate's Domination, Part 2. Written and copyright by A.A. Castor, narrated by Hazel. Welcome everyone to A.A. Castor Book Club. Today's story is Kate's Domination. Prepare yourselves for a provocative journey into the mind of a woman who finds power and pleasure in absolute control. This tale delves into the intense dynamics between a young woman and the men who willingly submit to her, exploring the boundaries of dominance, submission, and the darker aspects of human desire. Be ready for a narrative that challenges the conventional, pushing the limits of power and obedience in a way that is both captivating and unsettling. Scene 8, The Fancy Treat. The day after their intense encounter in the woods, Johnny received a call from Kate. Her voice, as always, carried that familiar mix of authority and indifference. "I'm bored, Johnny," Kate said casually, as if it were his responsibility to entertain her. "Treat me to something fancy." Johnny's heart raced at the opportunity to impress her. He wanted to show Kate just how much she meant to him, how much he loved her, despite everything. He quickly sprang into action, making calls and searching online for the perfect place to take her. After an hour of planning, Johnny managed to book a table at one of the most expensive restaurants in town, a place he could barely afford but was willing to stretch his budget for. He wanted everything to be perfect for Kate, to make her feel special and adored. But just booking the restaurant wasn't enough. Johnny knew Kate had a taste for luxury, so he spent the rest of the day shopping for gifts. He bought her a branded handbag, something sleek and stylish that he knew she would love. He picked out a pair of designer shoes, ones that would complement her wardrobe perfectly. He even selected a bouquet of her favorite flowers, hoping to bring a smile to her face. When the evening came, Johnny stood nervously outside Kate's apartment, holding the gifts in one hand and the flowers in the other. He had dressed in his best clothes, wanting to make a good impression. Kate opened the door, looking as stunning as ever. Her eyes swept over the gifts, and a slight smile tugged at the corners of her lips, though her expression remained cool. "You went all out, didn't you?" Kate said, taking the flowers from his hand and sniffing them delicately. "Anything for you, Kate," Johnny replied, his voice filled with earnest affection. "I just wanted to make you happy." Kate examined the branded bag and shoes with a critical eye before finally meeting Johnny's gaze. "Let's see if your efforts pay off," she said, her tone a mix of teasing and expectation. They left for the restaurant, Johnny feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He hoped that the evening would go well, that Kate would see how much he cared for her. As they walked into the upscale establishment, Johnny felt a surge of pride, knowing he had managed to secure such a coveted reservation. Kate, however, remained composed and slightly aloof, her presence commanding attention as they were seated. Johnny did everything he could to cater to her, ordering the finest dishes, pouring her wine, and showering her with compliments. The entire time he watched her intently, hoping for a sign that she was pleased. Kate accepted his gestures with an air of indifference, acknowledging his efforts, but never fully revealing her thoughts. She was used to being treated like royalty, and while Johnny's actions didn't go unnoticed, they also didn't seem to surprise her. As the evening progressed, Johnny's nerves began to settle. They shared conversation over dinner, with Kate occasionally smiling at his attempts to make her laugh. She enjoyed the control she had over him, knowing that he would go to any lengths to please her. When the meal was over, Johnny handed Kate the gifts. She opened them with deliberate slowness, her face unreadable as she examined the expensive items. After a moment, she looked at Johnny, her eyes softening ever so slightly. "Thank you, Johnny," Kate said, her voice carrying a hint of genuine appreciation. "You've done well." Johnny's heart swelled with happiness. "Anything for you, Kate," he replied, feeling as if all his efforts had been worth it. Kate took his hand, her grip firm yet gentle. "Let's see where this goes," she said, her words filled with promise and an unspoken challenge. Johnny nodded eagerly, ready to follow her lead wherever it might take him. Scene 9, The Dance of Control. Johnny couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction as he watched Kate sip her drink, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in her cold, calculating eyes. It had been a good night, better than most, in fact. There was something about the way Kate tore into him, her insults sharp and merciless, that made him feel more alive than anything else. Every cutting remark, every time she called him stupid, it was like a jolt to his system, awakening something deep within him that he couldn't explain, but didn't want to lose. Kate was in the middle of berating him for some minor mistake when Johnny's attention wavered. Across the bar, a woman caught his eye. Her laugh was light, carefree, a stark contrast to the tension at their table. For a moment, Johnny found himself drawn to her, wondering what it would be like to sit with someone who wasn't constantly looking for ways to tear him down. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he regretted it. He quickly looked back at Kate, but it was too late, she had noticed. Even though she pretended not to see, he could tell by the slight narrowing of her eyes and the way her grip tightened on her glass that she had caught him. "Johnny," Kate said, her voice deceptively sweet, "why don't we go up to the room?" He knew better than to question her. With a nod, he stood, dropping a few bills on the table before following her upstairs. His heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. The night had taken a turn, and he knew Kate well enough to sense that she had something planned for him. Once they were in the room, Kate wasted no time. She pushed him onto the bed, her movements quick and deliberate. Before he could say anything, she was on top of him, her hands expertly tying him to the bedposts with the silk ties she always carried. Johnny's breath quickened, excitement coursing through him as he felt the familiar bite of the restraints against his wrists. He didn't say a word as she secured him to the bed. He liked it this way, the sense of helplessness, the way it made him feel at her mercy. He was eager to see what she would do next, eager to see how far she would push him tonight. Kate straddled him, her face inches from his as she stared into his eyes. "Johnny," she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous purr, "why did you cheat on me?" Johnny's mind raced. "Cheat?" he stammered, trying to play dumb. "I didn't cheat on you, Kate. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Kate hissed, her eyes narrowing. "I saw the way you looked at that woman downstairs. You think I didn't notice? You think you can just look at other women when you're with me?" There was no use denying it. The truth was, the idea of losing power, of feeling her jealousy and rage, was thrilling him in ways he could barely comprehend. He could feel himself getting hard, the rush of excitement mingling with a strange sense of fear. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Johnny whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry." Kate's eyes flickered downward, and she noticed his arousal. A wicked smile spread across her face as she reached over to the nightstand and picked up the knife she kept there. The blade glinted in the low light as she brought it close to his skin, her eyes never leaving his. "Are you turned on because of her?" Kate asked, her voice icy as she traced the tip of the knife along his thigh, inching closer to his most sensitive area. "No, ma'am," Johnny said quickly, his breath catching in his throat. "It's because of you, only you." Kate's smile widened, and she pressed the knife a little harder, just enough to make him wince. "Good," she murmured. "Because if you ever cheat on me again, I'll cut it off. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Johnny gasped, his body trembling with a mix of fear and arousal. "I understand. You can cut it off if I ever cheat on you again." Satisfied, Kate pulled the knife away, but not before teasing him a little longer, dragging the sharp edge lightly over his skin. The sensation was almost too much to bear, and Johnny's mind swirled with conflicting emotions, desire, fear, and a deep, aching need for her approval. "Are you sorry, Johnny?" Kate asked, her voice softening just a fraction as she looked down at him. "Yes," he breathed, his eyes pleading with hers. "I'm sorry, Kate." Kate nodded, her expression finally softening as she leaned down to whisper in his ear, "Good boy." The combination of her words, her touch, and the knife still lingering near his skin was too much. Johnny felt himself let go, the intensity of the moment overwhelming him as he released all the pent-up tension in his body. He finished on the knife, his breath coming in ragged gasps as Kate watched him with a satisfied smirk. "Remember," she whispered, running a hand through his hair, "next time it might not be so easy. Scene 10, The Price of Devotion." The room was still, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint rustle of the curtains as they swayed with the breeze. Kate sat on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the window, her expression one of quiet frustration. Johnny, sensing the shift in her mood, approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't want to work as a secretary anymore," Kate said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. She turned to face Johnny, her eyes sharp, a hint of irritation simmering beneath the surface. "The job annoys me. I'm done with it." Johnny nodded, his mind racing to find the right words. He knew that when Kate made up her mind, there was no changing it. Her job had always seemed beneath her, a temporary role that never truly suited her ambition or demeanor. But now that she was ready to leave it behind, he could feel the weight of her expectations pressing down on him. "I understand, Kate," Johnny replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. "I'm not rich, but I'm willing to support you however I can." A slow smile spread across Kate's lips, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Oh, you are so sweet, Johnny," she murmured, her tone almost affectionate. But then her expression hardened, her smile fading as she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a low, warning tone. "But don't think that just because you're willing to support me, I'll let you be inside of me. I don't like having sex with you. Do you understand that? So don't expect anything from me." Johnny's heart sank, but he kept his composure. He had always known that Kate's affection came with conditions, that her approval was something he had to earn constantly. The intimacy he craved, the connection he longed for, was always just out of reach, a prize she dangled before him, but never truly offered. Yet her words didn't hurt as much as he thought they would. Instead, they only deepened his resolve to be whatever she needed him to be. "No, ma'am," Johnny said softly, bowing his head in deference. "I won't disrespect you." Kate's smile returned, this time with a hint of satisfaction. She reached out, cupping his chin and lifting his face so their eyes met. "Good boy," she purred. "For that, I'll let you call me Princess, but only when I allow it." "Yes, Princess," Johnny replied, the title slipping from his lips like a sacred vow. He felt a strange mix of pride and relief. Pride that he had pleased her, and relief that she still saw value in him, even if it was in a way that left him wanting more. Kate stood up from the bed, her eyes scanning the room before they landed on his wallet, resting on the nightstand. Without a word, she walked over and picked it up, pulling out his credit card and ATM card. She held them up, her gaze locking onto his with an expectant look. "I need to pay my bills," she said matter-of-factly. "Can I use your card?" Johnny didn't hesitate. "Yes, Princess," he said, his voice filled with a quiet devotion. "Take them all. I don't need them. They'd be more useful to you." A sense of usefulness swelled in Johnny's chest as he watched her slip the cards into her purse. The act of giving her access to his finances, of allowing her to take what she needed without question, filled him with a strange satisfaction. It was as if, in giving her control, he found a purpose, a way to prove his worth in her eyes. Kate noticed the change in his demeanor, the way his shoulders relaxed, the small smile that played on his lips. She loved it, the way he seemed to derive pleasure from his submission, from the way she held the reins in their relationship. It was exactly how she wanted it, her in control, him eager to please. "Good," Kate said, her voice softer now, almost tender as she leaned in and kissed his cheek. "You're a good man, Johnny." Johnny's heart swelled at her words, even though a part of him knew that they were as much about maintaining her control as they were about showing any real affection. But he didn't care. As long as she kept him close, as long as he could continue to serve her, he was happy. Kate straightened up, a satisfied smile on her lips as she turned to leave the room, her purse slung over her shoulder. "I'll be back later," she said over her shoulder. "Make sure everything is ready for me when I return." "Yes, Princess," Johnny replied, his voice full of quiet determination. As the door clicked shut behind her, Johnny remained standing in the middle of the room, a sense of contentment settling over him. He knew his place, and for now, that was enough. Scene 11, Temptations and Confessions. The bar buzzed with energy, the low thrum of music vibrating through the floor as people crowded around tables, chatting and laughing. Kate and Jane sat at a small round table near the back, their drinks in hand as they shared their frustrations about work. The dim lighting cast long shadows across their faces, adding to the intimate atmosphere of the conversation. "I swear, if I have to listen to my boss talk about another one of his brilliant ideas, I'm going to lose it," Jane said, her voice dripping with exasperation. She took a long sip of her cocktail, her eyes rolling dramatically. Kate nodded, swirling the ice in her glass. "I know exactly what you mean. Mine tried to touch my boob the other day." Jane's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Kate continued, her voice laced with disgust. "Can you believe that? He's married, and he still thinks he can get away with hitting on me. It's gross." Jane sighed, her frustration mirroring Kate's. "It's like they don't even see us as people. My boss spends more time staring at my chest than actually listening to my reports. And then after every meeting, he bombards me with questions, like he wasn't paying attention the entire time." Kate's expression darkened, but she forced a smile, leaning back in her chair. Men like that just can't help themselves. They think they can do whatever they want. Just as Jane was about to respond, the conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a man at the bar. He caught their attention immediately, tall, with a strong, masculine build and a confident aura that made him stand out in the crowd. His skin was fair, his hair neatly styled, and he exuded a kind of effortless charm that was hard to ignore. The man, who they quickly learned was named Keon, was the DJ for the evening, and his presence seemed to command the room. He had the kind of look that made heads turn, and both Kate and Jane couldn't help but exchange a glance, a silent acknowledgement of his attractiveness. Jane murmured, her eyes not leaving Keon as he made his way through the crowd. "He's cute." Kate nodded in agreement, though she kept her expression neutral. "Very." Keon seemed to notice their attention and wasted no time making his way over to their table. He approached with a casual confidence, his smile disarming as he greeted them. "Evening, ladies," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. Before either of them could respond, Keon leaned in and kissed Jane on the lips. The kiss was sudden, bold, and completely unexpected. Jane's eyes widened in mock surprise, but after a brief hesitation, she leaned into the kiss, letting it happen. There was something intoxicating about the way Keon took control, the way he made it seem so natural, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. As they kissed, Keon's hand slid down, lightly brushing against Jane's leg. The touch was subtle, but it sent a shiver up her spine, stirring something deep within her. She felt a rush of heat, a sudden surge of arousal that she hadn't expected, but didn't want to fight. Kate watched the exchange, her expression carefully guarded, but inside, her emotions were conflicted. She told herself that she wasn't interested, that this was just some guy trying to show off. But she couldn't deny the flicker of jealousy that sparked when Keon finally pulled away from Jane and turned his attention to her. "Why are you just watching?" Keon asked, his eyes locking onto Kate's with a knowing smile. He could see through her pretense, the way she tried to hide her interest behind a mask of indifference. Kate raised an eyebrow, feigning disinterest. "I'm not impressed," she lied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Keon chuckled, clearly not buying her act. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup her face gently. The touch was soft, but it sent a wave of heat through Kate's body, making her pulse quicken. Are you sure about that? Keon asked, his voice a low murmur as he leaned in. Before Kate could respond, he kissed her. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, one that left her no room to resist. His lips were warm and insistent, his hand sliding down to rest on her hip before moving up to her chest. Kate's breath hitched as his fingers brushed against her breast, a surge of desire flooding through her. She knew she should pull away, should push him back and tell him to stop, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself leaning into the kiss, letting the sensations wash over her. For a moment, it was just the two of them, lost in the heat of the moment. Kate's mind raced, torn between the thrill of his touch and the voice in her head telling her this was a mistake. But the longer the kiss lasted, the more that voice was drowned out by the rising tide of her desire. When Keon finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with intensity. "See?" he whispered, his lips brushing against hers. "You don't have to pretend with me." Kate's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest as she struggled to find her composure. She wanted to say something, anything to regain control of the situation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just stared at him, her mind spinning with the possibilities. Keon, seemingly satisfied with her silence, gave her a knowing smile before stepping back. "Let me get your number," he said, his tone casual as if he hadn't just turned her world upside down. Kate exchanged a glance with Jane, who was still recovering from her own encounter with Keon. They both knew this was dangerous territory, that Keon was the kind of man who could make them do things they might regret. But there was also a thrill in it, a sense of excitement that neither of them could deny. "Sure," Kate said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. She pulled out her phone, quickly exchanging numbers with Keon before slipping it back into her bag. Keon smiled, a look of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'll be in touch," he said, giving them a wink before turning to leave. As he walked away, Jane leaned in close to Kate, her voice low and filled with intrigue. "What just happened?" Kate shook her head, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had just passed through their evening. "I'm not sure," she admitted, her heart still racing, "but I think we're about to find out." Scene 12, Tempting Invitations. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains of Kate's bedroom, casting a warm glow across the room. She stretched lazily, her mind still lingering on the events of the previous night at the bar. The kiss from Keon, the thrill of his touch, it all played on a loop in her mind, leaving her with a mix of excitement and curiosity. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her out of her thoughts. Reaching over, she grabbed it and saw a message from Keon. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, eager to see what he had to say. "Morning, ladies. I had a great time last night. How about you both come over to my place today? Wear a dress." "I prefer my girls in dresses." Kate's breath caught as she read the message, her pulse quickening. She hesitated for a moment before scrolling down to see that Jane had already replied. "I have a boyfriend, Keon. We're about to get married." Kate felt a flicker of tension. She knew Jane was committed to her fiancé, but after what had happened last night, she wondered how much that commitment really meant. Keon's reply came quickly, almost dismissive in its tone. "I didn't ask if you had a boyfriend. I told you to come here. Don't worry, I'll be nice. I just want to spend some time together." Kate's heart raced as she reread the exchange. There was something about Keon's confidence, his insistence, that both intrigued and unsettled her. She could feel the excitement building in her, knowing that Jane was still considering going, despite her engagement. Unable to resist, Kate sent Jane a quick message. "Did you see his last message? Are you really going?" Jane's response came almost immediately, the words surprising Kate. "Let's not tell my soon-to-be husband. It's just spending time with Keon, right? No big deal." Kate smiled at Jane's rationalization. She could sense that Jane was just as intrigued by Keon as she was, despite their different circumstances. Without overthinking it, Kate replied, "You're right, it's no big deal. Let's go." Later that day, Kate and Jane stood outside Kian's apartment, the air thick with anticipation. Jane had chosen a sexy, form-fitting dress that left little to the imagination, while Kate had opted for something more conservative, cute and demure, but still elegant. She wanted to see how Kian would react to both their styles, to see if his preference was as straightforward as he claimed. When Kian opened the door, his smile widened at the sight of the two women standing before him. "Well, don't you both look lovely?" he said, his eyes flicking between them with an approving gleam. As they stepped inside, Kate and Jane noticed a series of framed photographs on a side table, pictures of a woman and two young children. Jane's eyes narrowed as she looked at Kian. "You're married?" she asked, her tone a mix of surprise and curiosity. Kian shrugged casually, closing the door behind them. "Yes, but don't worry. My wife's okay with me spending time with other women. She knows who I am." Jane exchanged a glance with Kate, a look of amazement in her eyes. Kian's nonchalant attitude toward his marriage was shocking, yet somehow it made him even more intriguing, as if his life operated by a different set of rules. Kian guided them to the living room, gesturing for Jane to sit on his lap. Jane hesitated only for a second before complying, her dress riding up slightly as she settled onto his lap. Kian turned to Kate, patting the spot next to him on the couch. "And you, Kate, why don't you sit right here?" Kate sat down, her heart racing as she observed the way Kian effortlessly took control of the situation. She was torn between the excitement of being part of something so taboo and the lingering unease that nagged at the back of her mind. Kian's attention returned to Jane, his hand resting lightly on her thigh. "So, you're getting married soon?" he said, his tone conversational, though his hand betrayed the casualness as it slowly slid higher up her leg. "Yes," Jane replied, her voice a bit shaky. "My fiancé is very hard-working. He's a good man." Kian's lips curved into a sly smile. "Does he know that you're here with me? Jane hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to Kate before she shook her head. "No, he doesn't know." Kian's smile widened, his hand continuing its slow exploration. "That's okay. Sometimes it's good to have a little fun before settling down. You've done this before, haven't you?" Jane bit her lip, her gaze dropping as she nodded. "Yes, it's not the first time." Kate watched the exchange, feeling the tension build in the room. She could sense the way Kian's words were pulling Jane deeper into his world, the way he was slowly eroding her defenses. And as much as she tried to resist, Kate couldn't help but feel a similar pull, a curiosity about what might happen next. As Kian leaned in to kiss Jane, his hand sliding beneath the fabric of her dress, Kate felt a surge of conflicted emotions, excitement, jealousy, and a strange sense of inevitability. She knew she was crossing a line, but the thrill of it all was too powerful to ignore. "Relax," Kian murmured to Jane as his lips moved from hers to her neck, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You're going to enjoy this." Kate's breath caught as she watched, her own desires mixing with a growing sense of complicity. There was no turning back now, not for any of them. Scene 13, The Edge of Desire. Kate sat quietly on the plush couch, her hands resting in her lap as she watched the scene unfold before her. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of excitement and forbidden desire that seemed to hang over the room like a heavy fog. Her heart raced, the anticipation building with each passing second as she observed Kian and Jane, her own emotions a tangled mess of curiosity, jealousy, and something darker she couldn't quite name. Kian had turned his full attention to Jane now, his hands roaming over her body with a practiced ease that made it clear he knew exactly what he was doing. Jane, for her part, was fully under his spell, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as she let him guide her, her inhibitions melting away with every touch, every kiss. There was something intoxicating about the way Kian moved, the way he spoke to Jane in low, seductive tones that made Kate's pulse quicken despite herself. He was dangerous. That much was clear. Dangerous in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, the kind of man who could make you forget who you were, what you believed in, and pull you into his world without a second thought. Jane, caught up in the heat of the moment, seemed to have forgotten everything outside of this room, her fiancé, her upcoming wedding, the life she was supposed to be building. None of it seemed to matter anymore as she let Keon take control, her hands tangled in his hair, her body arching toward him in a silent plea for more. Keon responded with a wicked smile, his lips moving from her mouth to her neck, then lower, trailing kisses down to her chest. His hands slid beneath her dress, pushing the fabric aside with a deliberate slowness that made Jane shudder with anticipation. Kate watched, unable to look away, as Keon's kisses moved further down Jane's body, his mouth tracing a path of fire over her skin. She could see the way Jane's breath hitched, the way her eyes fluttered shut as she surrendered completely to the moment, her mind lost in the intoxication of desire. As Keon's lips reached Jane's most intimate parts, he paused for a moment, inhaling deeply before looking up at her with a teasing grin. Like fresh cherries," he murmured, his voice dripping with sensuality. The compliment was both playful and intimate, a deliberate provocation that made Jane gasp in delight. Jane's fingers tightened in his hair, her head falling back as she whispered, "Deeper. Please, Keon, deeper." Keon needed no further encouragement. His tongue darted out, teasing her gently at first before pressing deeper, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to drive her to the brink of madness. Jane's hips bucked against him, a soft moan escaping her lips as she lost herself in the sensations, her mind completely focused on the pleasure coursing through her body. Kate's heart pounded in her chest as she continued to watch, her own body reacting to the scene despite her attempts to remain detached. There was something hypnotic about the way Keon worked, the way he seemed to know exactly what Jane wanted, what she needed, without her having to say a word. It was as if he had complete control over her, pulling her strings like a master puppeteer, and Jane was more than willing to let him. As Jane's moans grew louder, her hands gripping Keon's hair as if she was afraid to let go, Kate felt a surge of jealousy mixed with an unexpected thrill. She was aroused by the display, but also envious of the attention Jane was receiving, the way Keon seemed to know exactly how to make her feel like the only woman in the world. It was a dangerous thought, one that made her realize just how far she had fallen under his spell. Keon's movements quickened, his tongue moving in a rhythm that had Jane writhing beneath him, her breaths coming in desperate, broken gasps. "Yes. Oh, God, yes," she moaned, her voice thick with desire, completely oblivious to anything other than the pleasure Keon was giving her. For a moment, Kate wondered if Jane would feel any remorse later, if she would regret cheating on her fiancé, a man who clearly loved her and was working hard to build a life for them. But as she watched the way Jane responded to Keon, the way she seemed to revel in the act of betrayal, Kate realized that Jane didn't care, at least not right now. To Jane, this wasn't a mistake. It was a secret thrill, a moment of indulgence that would remain hidden from the rest of the world. A person never got hurt if they never knew, after all. And maybe, just maybe, Kate thought as she watched Jane fall deeper under Keon's spell, there was something liberating in that. Something about shedding the weight of guilt and living in the moment, no matter the consequences. As Keon brought Jane closer to the edge, Kate felt her own desire building, a wave of heat that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. She knew she shouldn't be enjoying this, shouldn't be thinking about how it would feel to have Keon's attention on her instead, but she couldn't help herself. The lines were already blurred, the boundaries crossed, and now there was no turning back. Finally, Jane let out a sharp cry, her body tensing as she reached the peak of pleasure, her hands gripping Keon's head as she rode out the waves of her orgasm. Keon didn't stop until she was completely spent, his tongue moving slower now, gentler, coaxing every last bit of satisfaction from her before he finally pulled away, a satisfied smirk on his face. Jane collapsed back against the couch, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath, a dazed, contented smile on her lips. She didn't look at Kate, didn't seem to care that her friend had witnessed the entire thing. All that mattered now was the lingering pleasure, the heady sense of having done something forbidden and thrilling. Kian, still kneeling between Jane's legs, turned his attention to Kate, his eyes dark and intense as they met hers. The look he gave her was full of promise, a silent invitation that sent a shiver down her spine. Kate's breath caught in her throat, her body reacting to his gaze in a way that both excited and terrified her. The room was heavy with the aftermath of Jane's pleasure, the tension between them palpable. And as Kate looked into Kian's eyes, she realized that this was just the beginning, that whatever boundaries had been crossed tonight, there were still more to be pushed, more lines to blur, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to resist. Scene 14, The Depths of Desire. Kate sat on the edge of the couch, her skin tingling with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The heat of the room seemed to intensify, beads of sweat forming at her temples as she watched Kian and Jane. The passion between them was palpable, a raw energy that filled the space and wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. She could feel the desire coursing through her veins, a burning need that she hadn't felt in a long time. Her eyes were drawn to Kian, to the way his body moved, the effortless confidence in his every gesture. He was intoxicating, his looks, his charm, his sheer presence. Every fiber of her being ached to be closer to him, to feel his touch, to let herself be swept away by the storm he had created in her heart. As if sensing her thoughts, Kian paused and looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with a knowing smile. He shifted his attention to Jane, who was still recovering from the intensity of their earlier encounter, her body humming with the afterglow of pleasure. "Jane," Kian murmured, his voice low and smooth, "kiss Kate." Kate's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as she processed his words. She was surprised, but not entirely unprepared. There was a part of her that had been hoping, waiting for something like this to happen, though she hadn't dared to admit it to herself. The thought of being kissed by Jane, another woman, sent a thrill through her, a forbidden excitement that only heightened her arousal. Jane didn't hesitate. Her eyes dark with desire, she turned to Kate, leaning in close until their faces were just inches apart. Kate could feel Jane's breath on her lips, warm and inviting, and before she could fully process what was happening, Jane closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to Kate's in a kiss that was soft yet firm. Kate gasped against Jane's mouth, her body stiffening for a moment before she gave in, letting the kiss happen. There was something oddly comforting in the way Jane kissed her, as if she was guiding her through this new experience with a gentle yet insistent touch. The kiss deepened, growing more passionate as Jane's hands came up to cradle Kate's face, her fingers tangling in Kate's hair. The sensation was overwhelming. Kate's mind spun, caught between the shock of the situation and the undeniable pleasure that was starting to take hold. She had never imagined being in this position, but now that she was, it felt strangely right, like a door she hadn't known was there had just been opened, revealing a world of possibilities she had never considered. As their lips moved together, Kate felt Jane's hands start to roam, sliding down her neck to her shoulders, then lower, exploring her body with a tenderness that was both thrilling and terrifying. Jane was taking control, leading the way with a confidence that left Kate breathless. Meanwhile, Kian had not remained idle. He continued his ministrations on Jane, his mouth working its way over her body, his hands gripping her hips as he pulled her closer. His lips traced a path down her back, kissing and nibbling at her skin as he moved lower, his touch sending shivers of pleasure through her. Jane's focus shifted back to Kian for a moment, her breath hitching as she felt his kisses travel down her spine. But even as her attention was divided, she didn't stop kissing Kate, her lips moving with a fervor that spoke of deep-seated desire. Kate felt Jane's hands start to tug at the hem of her dress, pulling it up over her thighs with a sense of urgency that made Kate's heart race. She was aware of every movement, every touch, as Jane slowly removed her clothes, exposing her skin to the cool air of the room. The sensation of being undressed, of being laid bare before both Jane and Kian, was almost too much to bear. But Kate didn't resist. Instead, she allowed herself to be swept along, letting the desire take over. As Jane's hands explored Kate's now exposed body, Kian positioned himself behind Jane, his fingers brushing against her before sliding inside, eliciting a moan from her lips that reverberated through Kate. The sound was intoxicating, making Kate's pulse quicken with anticipation. Kian moved with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment as he prepared to take Jane once more. He positioned himself at her entrance, teasing her with the promise of what was to come. Jane's breath hitched, her body trembling with need as she waited for him to take her, her hands gripping Kate's shoulders as if seeking an anchor in the storm of desire that had engulfed them all. Finally, Kian pushed inside, filling Jane with a single, smooth thrust that made her cry out in pleasure. She could feel him, hard, long, and so much more than she was used to. The sensation of him inside her was overwhelming, a mix of pain and pleasure that had her gasping for breath, her nails digging into Kate's skin as she tried to hold on. Kate watched, her body on fire with desire as she saw the way Jane responded to Kian, the way her body moved in sync with his, the sounds of their passion filling the room. There was something deeply arousing about the scene, something that made Kate's own desires flare to life, her body aching with the need to be touched, to be taken in the same way. Kian's movements grew more intense, each thrust driving deeper into Jane, pushing her closer and closer to the edge. Jane's eyes fluttered closed, her head falling back as she let out a long, low moan, her body responding to every movement, every touch, with a desperate kind of urgency. Kate could feel the heat radiating off both of them, the tension in the air so thick she could almost taste it. Her own arousal was reaching a fever pitch, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she watched Kian take Jane, watched the way he brought her to the brink of ecstasy with every thrust. "Kate," Kian murmured, his voice thick with desire as he glanced over at her, his eyes dark and intense. "Do you see how much she wants this? How much she needs this?" Kate's heart skipped a beat, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation as she nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She could barely think, barely breathe, as she watched Kian take Jane to heights of pleasure that left her gasping, trembling, lost in the throes of ecstasy. And as Kate sat there, watching the two of them, she realized that she wanted it too. Wanted to feel the same pleasure, the same release that Jane was experiencing. She wanted to lose herself in the moment, to give in to the desire that was burning her up from the inside out. Kian's movements grew faster, more intense, driving Jane closer and closer to the edge. And as Jane's body finally tensed, her breath catching in her throat as she reached her climax, Kate felt a shiver run down her spine, her own body reacting to the sight, the sound, the sheer intensity of the moment. Jane's cry of pleasure filled the room, her body trembling as she came, her hands gripping Kate's shoulders as she held on, riding out the waves of her orgasm. And as Kian followed her over the edge, his own release coming in a low, guttural groan, Kate knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Scene 15, The Edge of Control. Kate's breath caught in her throat as she watched Kian and Jane, the intensity of their encounter leaving her spellbound. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and desire, a heady mix that wrapped around her senses and made her pulse race. Kian's final, powerful thrusts had sent Jane over the edge, and the raw, primal way he took her stirred something deep within Kate, a mixture of jealousy, longing, and a need she could no longer ignore. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the sight of Kian and Jane entangled in each other, their bodies slick with sweat, the room echoing with the remnants of their shared passion. As Kate watched, a feeling of intoxication washed over her, a dizzying sensation that left her breathless. Her body responded almost instinctively, a flush of heat spreading across her skin as she felt a growing pressure deep inside her. Without thinking, Kate's hand drifted down to her own body, her fingers pressing against herself as she watched Keon pull away from Jane. The sensation was electric, a jolt that sent shivers through her as she found herself lost in the moment. Her touch was tentative at first, exploring, but as the tension in her body built, her movements grew more insistent, driven by a desperate need to feel something, anything that could match the intensity of what she had just witnessed. Keon, catching sight of Kate's actions, turned his gaze to her, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He saw the way she was touching herself, the way her body moved in response to her own touch, and it only fueled his desire further. He was in control here, and he knew it. Every glance, every word, every action was designed to draw these women deeper into his world, a world where he was the center of their attention, their need. "Jane," Keon said, his voice low and commanding, "come here." Jane, still trembling from her release, slowly turned to face Keon, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was flushed, her eyes glazed with a mixture of exhaustion and desire. She obeyed him without hesitation, crawling over to where he sat, her movements slow and sensual. "Clean me," Keon instructed, his voice calm but firm. Jane's eyes flicked up to meet his, a flash of hesitation crossing her face, but the look was quickly replaced by one of submissive obedience. She lowered herself further, her mouth hovering over him, and then, with a tentative touch, she began to lick his skin, cleaning him as he had commanded. "This isn't something I've ever done with my fiancé," Jane whispered, a hint of guilt lacing her words, but her actions betrayed her, revealing a hidden part of herself that craved this surrender. Keon's response was as cold as it was dismissive. "I don't care," he said, his tone almost cruel in its indifference. "I'm better than your future husband, and you know it." His words cut deep, and yet they seemed to ignite something in Jane, pushing her to continue with renewed fervor. Her tongue moved more eagerly now, her hands bracing herself as she took him into her mouth, her entire focus narrowed down to this one act of submission. Keon's hand rested on her head, guiding her movements with a possessive grip, his own pleasure evident in the way his breath hitched. Kate, meanwhile, was on the brink, watching them, feeling the heat in the room, the sound of their labored breaths. Everything pushed her closer to the edge. She stood up, unable to bear the distance between her and Keon any longer, her body drawn to him like a moth to a flame. Without a word, she leaned down and kissed him, her lips desperate and hungry against his. Keon responded in kind, one hand still in Jane's hair as the other wrapped around Kate's waist, pulling her closer. The kiss was fierce, almost brutal in its intensity, as if he was claiming her in that moment, marking her as his. Kate kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all of her pent-up desire, her confusion, and her need into that one act. As they kissed, Keon's hand slid down to Kate's body, his fingers finding their way between her legs. The touch was electric, sending shock waves through her body that made her moan against his lips. She was already on edge, her earlier self-exploration having brought her dangerously close to the brink, and Keon's skilled touch was all it took to push her further. "You enjoyed watching, didn't you?" Khan murmured against her lips, his voice a low, teasing whisper. Kate could only nod, her mind too clouded with pleasure to form coherent words. The truth was undeniable, she had enjoyed it more than she wanted to admit. Keon's fingers moved with expert precision, playing with her in a way that made her entire body tremble. The pleasure was overwhelming, building in intensity with every passing second, until Kate could barely stand it. She clung to Keon, her nails digging into his shoulders as she lost herself in the sensations he was giving her. Just when Kate thought she couldn't take any more, Keon pulled back, a wicked smile on his lips as he turned his attention to Jane, who had been watching them with a mixture of fascination and desire. "Both of you," Kian said, his voice taking on that commanding tone again. "Show me how you taste each other." Kate's breath caught in her throat, the request sending a fresh wave of arousal through her. She looked at Jane, who met her gaze with a mix of uncertainty and excitement. They were both in uncharted territory now, both caught up in Kian's web, and neither of them seemed willing to resist. Slowly, hesitantly, Kate and Jane moved closer to each other, their eyes locked as they shared a moment of mutual understanding. This was a line they were about to cross, one that would change everything, and yet neither of them could bring themselves to turn back. With a final glance at Kian, who watched them with that same satisfied smirk, Kate leaned in and kissed Jane, her lips soft and hesitant at first. But as the kiss deepened, the hesitation melted away, replaced by a shared hunger that neither of them could deny. Their hands began to explore each other, their movements growing more confident as they let the moment take over. Kate felt Jane's touch on her skin, felt the warmth of her body pressed against hers, and it only fueled her desire, driving her to explore more, to push further. As their bodies intertwined, their mouths exploring each other in a new, forbidden way, Kate realized that she had stepped into a world she never knew existed, a world where desire ruled, where boundaries blurred, and where the only thing that mattered was the pleasure they could give and receive. Kian watched them with a look of pure satisfaction, knowing that he had orchestrated this moment, that he was the one pulling the strings. And as Kate and Jane lost themselves in each other, he knew that he had them right where he wanted them, completely under his control and entirely at his mercy. Scene 16, Bound by Desire. The room was thick with the scent of sweat and anticipation. Every breath Kate took felt charged with electricity. The intimacy of the moment was both intoxicating and overwhelming, leaving her senses heightened, her mind reeling with a mix of desire and curiosity. She was no longer just a spectator to the passions that had unfolded around her. She was now fully immersed, drawn deeper into a world she had only glimpsed from the edges. Jane moved above her, the warmth of her skin, the weight of her presence, pressing down on Kate with an intimacy that was both unfamiliar and strangely natural. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing now, only the pull of the moment, guiding her forward. Kate found herself between Jane's legs, her breath quickening as she took in the sight before her. She could feel the heat radiating from Jane's body, the pulse of her desire evident in every tremble and quiver. The sensations were intense, almost overwhelming, but Kate was drawn to them, unable to resist the urge to explore further. As she leaned in, she could taste the essence of their shared moments, salty, sweet, and intoxicatingly raw. The flavor was new to her, foreign, but there was something about it that drove her to continue to taste more, to lose herself in the experience. Every movement, every touch was guided by an instinct she hadn't known she possessed, as if the boundaries she had once known had dissolved completely, leaving only the immediacy of the present. Jane, caught in the throes of her own pleasure, responded eagerly, pushing down further, urging Kate to take everything she had to offer. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a silent agreement to explore these uncharted territories together, with no expectations, no judgments, only the shared experience of the moment. Kian watched from his position nearby, his gaze intense and focused, his satisfaction evident in the way his eyes traced the movements of the two women before him. He was the orchestrator of this scene, the one who had drawn them into his world, and he reveled in the power he held over them. Yet there was also a kind of reverence in his gaze, a deep appreciation for the way they had both surrendered to the desires he had unlocked within them. "Clean her," Kian instructed, his voice calm, almost gentle, but laced with an authority that made it clear he expected to be obeyed. Kate obeyed without hesitation, her mind too consumed by the heat of the moment to resist. She licked, tasted, swallowed, driven by a desire to please, to fulfill the role she had been given in this intimate dance. Each movement felt like a step deeper into a realm where pleasure reigned supreme, where nothing existed outside of this room, this moment, these people. The scene played out in slow, deliberate motions, each touch, each taste, carrying with it the weight of their shared surrender. There was a beauty in it, a dark and twisted kind of beauty, but beauty nonetheless. A beauty that lay in the trust they had placed in one another, in the way they had let go of their inhibitions to embrace the unknown. And as the moments passed, Kate realized that she was no longer just a participant in this scene. She was a part of something larger, something that connected them all in a way that transcended the physical, something that bound them together through shared experience and mutual surrender. Scene 17, Reflection in the Aftermath. The bathroom was filled with the sound of running water, the steam rising around Kate and Jane as they stepped into the spacious shower. The warm water cascaded over their bodies, washing away the remnants of the night, but not the memory of what had just transpired. There was a shared sense of exhilaration between them, a quiet bond forged in the heat of their recent experiences. Kate reached for a bottle of soap, squeezing some into her hands before lathering it over her arms and shoulders. She glanced at Jane, who was busy washing her hair, a contented smile playing on her lips. The silence between them was comfortable, almost intimate, as they each processed the events in their own way. "Are you okay?" Kate finally asked, her voice soft as she turned to Jane. "Kian just came inside you. Are you on the pill or something?" Jane shook her head, rinsing the soap from her hair before looking back at Kate with a carefree expression. "No, but it's fine. I'm getting married soon, so it's not a big deal. If anything happens, I'll just tell him the condom was defective." Kate couldn't help but smile at Jane's nonchalance. It was a risky move, but Jane's confidence was contagious. "That's a smart move," Kate said, chuckling softly as she continued to wash. Jane shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "My fiancé lies all the time, so it's not an issue if I lie too, right? It's just evening the score." Kate laughed, shaking her head in amusement. There was a certain logic to Jane's reasoning, twisted though it might be. "You've got it all figured out, haven't you?" Before Jane could respond, the bathroom door opened, and Kian walked in, a camera in his hand. Both women stiffened slightly, their eyes flicking to the device. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt passing between them, but Kian quickly dispelled it with a reassuring smile. "It's okay," Kian said, his tone soothing as he approached them. "This is just for me. I promise." Kate and Jane exchanged a quick glance, the tension easing as they allowed themselves to relax. Kian stepped into the shower with them, the water splashing against his skin as he began to touch them both, his hands moving over their wet bodies with a familiar ease. "Spread your legs," Kian instructed Jane, his voice low and commanding. "I want to get this on video." Jane hesitated for a split second before complying, her cheeks flushing with a mix of embarrassment and excitement. She did as he asked, her heart pounding as she felt the camera's lens focus on her. The sensation of being watched, recorded, only heightened the thrill of the moment. As Kian filmed, he turned his attention to Kate, pulling her closer and kissing her deeply. The kiss was passionate, possessive, as if he was reminding her of the connection they had shared earlier. "I love you guys," Kian murmured against her lips. "Let's do this again sometime." Kate found herself nodding, her mind too clouded with the remnants of desire to think clearly. Jane, still caught up in the intensity of the situation, agreed as well, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she felt Kian's hand move over her stomach. Kian's fingers brushed over Jane's lower abdomen, his touch lingering as he looked into her eyes with a sly grin. "I hope I get you pregnant soon," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something dark and possessive. Jane's eyes widened slightly, her excitement mingling with confusion. "Why would you want that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kian chuckled, the sound low and almost sinister. "Don't you like the idea? Is your boyfriend good-looking?" Jane hesitated, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. Well, he's not, but he's kind and loving. He'll take care of me. That's good, Keon replied smoothly, his smile never faltering. He can take care of my child, then? Kate, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and amusement, couldn't help but smile at Keon's audacity. It would be a cute baby for sure, she said, her tone light and teasing. Not like Jane's boyfriend. The three of them laughed, the sound echoing off the tiled walls of the bathroom. But beneath the laughter, there was an undercurrent of something else. Something unspoken that lingered in the air. A subtle reminder of the tangled web of desire, deception, and power that now bound them together. And as they stood there, the water still cascading over them, the camera capturing every moment, they knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be more nights like this, more moments of reckless abandon, and that each one would draw them deeper into a world they were only beginning to explore. Scene 18, Corporate Tension. Kate adjusted the hem of her pencil skirt, its crisp lines a stark contrast to the disarray of her thoughts. The elevator dinged softly, announcing her arrival on the 18th floor. Stepping out, she felt the weight of the office's sterile air, its artificial chill biting against her skin. "Well, look who's back," murmured Jane from the adjacent cubicle, her tone dripping with feigned surprise. "Thought you'd finally ditched this place for good." Kate offered a tight smile. "Guess I'm not that lucky." She navigated the maze of workstations, the familiar hum of keyboards and muted phone conversations enveloping her. As she approached her desk, a gruff voice halted her in her tracks. "Kate, in my office now at it." She turned to see Bob Prescott, her boss, standing by the door to his office. Bob was a man well past his prime, but he still carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his power and influence were enough to overshadow his deteriorating appearance. His rotund figure strained against his once white shirt, now yellowing around the collar. A greasy sheen covered his balding head, which he frequently wiped with an old handkerchief tucked into his pocket. His face was flushed, the ruddy complexion a permanent reminder of his fondness for long lunches filled with greasy food and too much whiskey. Bob's beady, calculating eyes scanned the office with a predatory gleam, often lingering too long on the female employees. His thin, oily hair was combed back in a failed attempt to disguise the deep recession of his hairline. The combination of his stained tie, which always seemed a little askew, and the faint odor of stale sweat clinging to him, made it clear that Bob cared more about indulging in his vices than maintaining any semblance of professionalism. "Sure thing," Kate replied, masking her disdain with practiced indifference as she followed him into his office. Inside Bob's office, the blinds were half drawn, casting slatted shadows across the room. The heavy scent of old cigars clung to the leather furniture, and the soft hum of the ancient air conditioning unit did little to mask the stale odor that lingered in the air. Bob settled into his worn leather chair with a grunt, its creak echoing the tension in the air. "So," he began, tapping a stubby finger on a stack of papers. "Care to explain why your reports are delayed, and where you've been for the past week without so much as a courtesy call?" Kate took a deep breath, her mind racing. "I was unwell," she said, feigning a cough for effect. "It came on suddenly." Bob leaned back, his bulk straining the chair, eyeing her skeptically. "Is that so? You know, such negligence could get you fired." She stepped closer, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "Fired? Over a little illness? That seems harsh." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound. "Rules are rules, sweetheart." Kate's gaze drifted to the door, ensuring it was firmly shut. "Perhaps," she whispered, perching on the edge of his desk, "we can come to an understanding." Bob's eyes widened slightly as she leaned in, her blouse offering a tantalizing glimpse. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, his voice thick, betraying the hunger he tried to hide. She reached out, her fingers grazing his tie, feeling the sticky fabric. "Maybe," she began, slowly undoing the knot, "I can make it up to you." Bob swallowed hard, his facade of authority crumbling. "You always did know how to negotiate," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. Kate smirked, her hand trailing down to his belt. "I aim to please." As she unfastened his zipper, Bob's breath hitched, his eyes half-lidded in anticipation. "You're playing a dangerous game," he managed, his hands gravitating to her hips, his fingers leaving greasy prints on the smooth fabric. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Am I? Or are you just enjoying the perks of being the boss?" He chuckled, his hands squeezing her backside with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "You've got a point." Moments later, as Kate's hand worked its magic, Bob's face flushed, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "You're quite skilled," he panted, his voice breaking under the pressure of his own desire. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear, her voice low and controlled. "And you're quite easy to please." With a final shudder, Bob released, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Kate withdrew her hand, wiping it discreetly with a tissue from his desk. "Are we good now?" she asked, standing up and smoothing her skirt, her expression unreadable. Bob nodded, a satisfied grin spreading across his flushed face. "Consider it forgotten." She leaned down, pressing a quick kiss to his clammy cheek. "Pleasure doing business." As she turned to leave, Bob gave her a playful swat on the backside, his greasy hand leaving a mark. "Get back to work." Kate smirked, walking out with her head held high, the office's fluorescent lights reflecting off her confident stride. Scene 19, Bridal Reflections. The sunlight streamed through the large windows of Jane's apartment, casting a warm glow over the room filled with swatches of fabric, floral arrangements, and bridal magazines. The soft murmur of the city outside was a distant hum, as if the world had paused to make space for the anticipation of the coming week. Jane stepped out of her bedroom wearing her wedding dress, a conservative yet elegant gown that hugged her youthful figure just enough to highlight her beauty while maintaining an air of innocence. The lace sleeves cascaded delicately over her arms, and the bodice, though modest, accentuated her slender waist. The skirt flowed gently to the floor, its simple elegance embodying Jane's understated charm. Kate looked up from the invitation list she was reviewing, her breath catching slightly as she took in the sight of her friend. "Wow, Jane," she murmured, standing to get a closer look. "You look stunning. The dress is perfect." Jane smiled, a soft blush creeping into her cheeks. "You think so? I wasn't sure if it was too plain." Kate walked over, her hands reaching out to lightly touch the fabric, feeling the intricate lace under her fingers. "Plain? Not at all. It's beautiful. Just like you." Jane turned to the side, examining herself in the mirror, her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I wanted something that feels like me, you know? Nothing too flashy, but still special." Kate nodded, stepping back to admire the dress from a distance. "It's definitely you, elegant but with a quiet grace. I love it." Jane's smile widened, and she twirled slightly, watching the skirt swirl around her legs. "I can't believe it's happening in a week," she said, a note of disbelief in her voice. "It feels surreal." "Are you excited?" Kate asked, her tone light but curious. Jane paused, her fingers playing with the edge of the lace. "I guess I have to be, right? It's about time I stopped working and settled down." Kate raised an eyebrow. "That sounds a bit reluctant." Jane laughed, the sound a bit forced. "No, it's just, well, James is a nice guy and his family has money. I won't have to worry about working anymore, and honestly, that's what I want. He's always busy anyway, so it's not like I'll see him much. My priority now is just not working." Kate leaned against the back of the sofa, crossing her arms. "So, you're marrying James for convenience?" Jane shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "He's a good man and he can provide for me. It's not like I'm in love with him, but I do like him. And he likes me. That's enough, right?" Kate sighed, her mind drifting to her own situation. I envy you. The thought of quitting my job and not having to deal with, well, that sounds like a dream." Jane smirked, a glint of mischief in her eyes. Don't worry, Kate. I'll help you find a rich guy to take care of you, too. It's not that hard if you know where to look. Kate chuckled, shaking her head. It's not just about the money. I don't know. I guess I just want to be happy, you know? Jane's expression softened, and she walked over to Kate, placing a hand on her shoulder. You will be. We both will. We just have to be smart about it. Kate smiled, grateful for the reassurance, but something in Jane's words left her feeling hollow. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the joy of the moment. So, she said, trying to lighten the mood, how many people are we expecting for this grand event? Jane's eyes lit up, the tension between them dissipating. Around 100, give or take, just close friends and family. It's going to be beautiful. Scene 20, Forbidden Desires. The room was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that lingers just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest provocation to erupt. The afternoon sun cast elongated shadows, its golden rays filtering through the sheer curtains, painting intricate patterns on the hardwood floor. Kate's eyes lingered on Jane, taking in the way the wedding dress hugged her figure, the delicate lace juxtaposed against the latent sensuality that Jane exuded. Their earlier conversation had left a charged atmosphere, each word a brushstroke painting the canvas of their shared history and unspoken desires. Without warning, Kate closed the distance between them, her hand reaching out to gently tilt Jane's chin upward. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Slowly, deliberately, Kate leaned in, her lips brushing against Jane's in a tentative kiss. Jane responded, the initial surprise giving way to a fervent embrace. Their lips danced, a symphony of suppressed longing and newfound passion. The taste was familiar, a reminder of their previous encounter in front of Kian, yet this time it was untainted by external eyes. Kate's hands roamed, fingers tracing the contours of Jane's body through the delicate fabric. She moved behind Jane, pressing her body close, feeling the rapid rise and fall of Jane's chest. Her hands found their way to Jane's breasts, cupping them gently, eliciting a soft moan from Jane. "You look irresistible in this dress," Kate whispered into Jane's ear, her breath hot against the sensitive skin. "But perhaps we should bless it before James ever gets the chance." Jane chuckled softly, her head leaning back against Kate's shoulder. "Don't tell me you're jealous," she teased, a playful glint in her eyes. Kate smirked, her hands squeezing gently. "Jealous? Maybe, but I think you prefer me over him." Turning her head slightly, Jane's lips brushed against Kate's cheek. "Of course I do," she murmured, her voice dripping with sincerity. Emboldened, Kate guided Jane towards the plush chaise lounge near the window. "Bend over," she instructed softly, her voice leaving little room for argument. Jane complied, her hands gripping the armrest as she bent, the skirt of her wedding dress billowing around her. With deliberate slowness, Kate lifted the layers of tulle and silk, revealing the delicate lace underwear beneath. The contrast of the pure white fabric against Jane's flushed skin was intoxicating. Kate knelt, her fingers hooking into the waistband of the panties, sliding them down with reverence. She placed gentle kisses along the back of Jane's thighs, each touch sending shivers up Jane's spine. So eager," Jane whispered, her voice laced with anticipation. Kate chuckled softly, her breath ghosting over Jane's most intimate area. "I can't help it," she replied, her fingers parting Jane's folds. "You're irresistible." Without further preamble, Kate's tongue darted out, tracing intricate patterns, exploring every crevice with meticulous attention. Jane's breaths became ragged, her fingers gripping the fabric of the chaise with increasing fervor. "Oh, Kate," Jane moaned, her voice a symphony of pleasure, "you know exactly how to drive me wild." Kate's only response was to increase her efforts, her tongue delving deeper, her fingers joining in the exploration. She inserted one, then two fingers, curling them just right, hitting that spot that made Jane see stars. Jane's moans filled the room, a melodic testament to the ecstasy she was experiencing. Her body trembled, the tension building, coiling like a spring ready to snap. "Kate, I'm close," she managed between gasps. Kate doubled her efforts, her movements precise and unrelenting. Moments later, Jane's body tensed, a guttural moan escaping her lips as waves of pleasure crashed over her. She collapsed onto the chaise, her body spent, a sheen of sweat glistening on her skin. Kate rose, placing gentle kisses along Jane's spine, her hands soothingly rubbing her back. "Feeling blessed now?" she teased, a playful lilt in her voice. Jane laughed weakly, turning her head to face Kate. "Absolutely, best pre-wedding ritual ever." Kate grinned, leaning in for a soft, lingering kiss. "Bride and bridesmaid making each other happy," she murmured against Jane's lips. "That's what true friendship is all about." They stayed intertwined for a moment longer, basking in the afterglow, the world outside forgotten, if only for a fleeting moment.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, please share this podcast with your friends and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to visit my website at www.tonyc.info for more content, updates, and exclusive behind-the-scenes insights. This podcast is mainly supported by listeners like you. If you want to help keep the stories coming, consider supporting me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/JTAC. Even just $1 a month makes a huge difference and helps me continue to create the content you love. Thank you again for listening. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, stay safe and keep exploring the unknown.